Now, since I'm restricted to the supratentorial region, let me just give you a brief outline about the anatomy of the supratentorial region. It is that region. It is that region of the brain which is located above the tentorium cerebelli. It's the largest compartment of the brain, and it consists of the anterior as well as the middle cranial fossa. And amongst it, the cerebrum is the main component. Now, tumors arising in the supratentorial region can be either primary, which are commonest, 85%, and they include gliomas, meningiomas, colloid cysts, PNETs, or pituitary tumors. And in rare occasions, they can be secondaries, of which lung is the commonest primary site, followed by breast, and rarely it can come from malignant melanoma, hypernephroma, or colonic carcinomas. Now, supratentorial tumors are, on the basis of their locations, divided into either intraaxial or extraaxial. Intraaxial, amongst the brain parenchyma, we get gliomas, astrocytoma, oligodendrogliomas, and pinealomas. And it can be intraventricular, like ependymomas or choroid plexus papillomas. And extraaxial locations include meningiomas, pituitary adenoma, schwannoma, dermoid, craniopharyngioma, and chordoma. Now, supratentorial tumors, they have certain characteristics. Number one is they are more common in adults compared to pediatric age group, where the posterior fossa is more involved. These tumors, they present with headache, seizures, or neurological disorders. Their imaging studies, that is the CT and MRI, will exhibit in contrast enhancing rim with surrounding edema. And since they have significant mass, so the treatment consists of either surgical excision or surgical debulking, chemotherapy, or radiotherapy. Now, there are certain important neurophysiological considerations which need to be taken care of before proceeding with supratentorial tumors. We have to keep in mind that intracranial compartment has a fixed volume, and the three components, that is the brain, matter, blood, and CSF, they all coexist in that. So increase in any component of the supratentorial region will cause volume spatial compensation. And this compensation occurs up to a point where a particular rise in a particular component will be compensated by the decrease in the other, till a point when the ICP will rise exponentially, blood flow will reduce, and herniation will occur. Now, brain herniation, briefly, we need to know about it. They are of different types. It can be transcalvarial, where the brain matter extrudes out from the bony defect. It can be subfalcine, that is below the falx cerebri. It can be uncal, or it can be the cerebellar herniation, which occurs through the foramen magnum. Now, amongst the neurophysiological consideration, this is one formula which governs the entire neuroanesthetic mechanism. That is, cerebral perfusion pressure is equal to mean arterial pressure minus intracranial pressure. So, when cerebral perfusion pressure is the determining factor, mean arterial pressure and intracranial pressure are the different entities which governs the cerebral perfusion pressure, which ideally should be kept within the range of 70 millimeter of mercury. Any increase in ICP leads to decreased cerebral perfusion pressure, and it may further proceed to cause cerebral ischemia. Now, for keeping in mind this consideration, we need to know that intravenous as well as inhalational agents all can cause decrease in cerebral metabolism, and the technique lies in balancing the metabolism with blood flow, which will determine whether there is any increase or decrease of cerebral blood flow with that particular agent. And net cerebral blood flow in the brain is in totality determined by concentration of anesthetic agents, changes due to the pathology or anesthesia, autoregulatory changes which are inherent in the brain, and the impairment of carbon dioxide responsiveness. Now, amongst the commonly used intravenous anesthetics, we can see that all of them, the commonly used one, barbiturates, propofol, and edominate, equivocally cause a decrease in cerebral metabolism, cerebral blood flow, as well as intracranial pressure. The only exception is ketamine, which causes an equivocal rise of CMRO2, CBF, and ICP, and thus is not a very preferred choice. If we come to inhalational agents, we'll see that nitrous causes an increase in CMRO2, cerebral blood flow, and intracranial pressure. And apart from that, majority of the inhalational agents cause a decrease in CMRO2, but cerebral blood flow and ICP, they rise to varying degrees. This is a rough diagram which was presented by my previous speaker. It says that the agents above this red lines need to be avoided because all of them causes rise in ICP as well as cerebral blood flow. Now, coming to the clinical features of supratentorial tumors, there can be, as I said, that the cardinal feature is the rise in ICP. It causes headache, which is bursting or throbbing, often awakening the patient from sleep and aggravated by cough, posture change, and strain. They can be vomiting and papilledema as secondary features of raised ICP. Seizures can occur depending upon the location, and also depending upon the location, you can have focal neurological symptoms like sensory deficits, hemiparesis, and cranial nerve palsies. Now, while going for a preoperative assessment, we follow the same rules as we do for any other anesthetic. We need to document chief complaints, history of present illness, past history, personal history, drug history, and allergies. However, certain important considerations, especially when dealing with patients with supratentorial tumors, are the concomitant drug intake and their clinical implications. These patients are often on anticonvulsants like phenytoin, carbamazepine, and levetiracetam, and patients on long-standing anti-epileptic treatment actually require larger doses and or more frequent doses of non-depolarizing neuromuscular agents. They can be often on diuretics like furosemide or mannitol, which can lead to dyselectrolytemia and volume contraction. Steroids are often prescribed for reduction of brain edema, which themselves can cause hyperglycemia, HPA suppression, or mucosal effects on the gastrointestinal tract. And acetazolamide, which is often prescribed for reduction in CSF production, can cause metabolic acidosis and hypokalemia. So these interactions should be kept in mind. Then the general examination and the systemic examination proceeds in almost the same manner, except slight emphasis is given on the CNS, like higher mental functions, cranial nerves, motor sensory coordination, etc. Airway examination, as we do in other cases, where we document the Mallampati scoring, thyromental distance, sternomental distance, mouth opening, condition of the temporomandibular joints, dentition, neck movement, etc. Now, few considerations which need to be kept in mind. First, depending upon the level of consciousness of the patient, the GCS needs to be ascertained. Lower cranial nerve involvement, sensory deficits, hemiparesis, all of them need to be looked for, because these might cause impaired gag dysphagia. These may be elicited by the history of impaired gag, dysphagia, history of aspiration, pneumonia, etc. Whether or not there is presence and degree of raised ICP, that can be assessed by the amount of papilledema, Cushing's response, sutural diastasis, and bulging fontanalis. The last two, that is sutural diastasis and bulging fontanalis, is more common in pediatric patients because the skull hasn't fused as yet. Presence and absence of seizures in these patients, and the nature, position, and vascularity of the tumor also needs to be known beforehand, whether that's a solid or a cystic lesion. Other physiological conditions which need to be kept in mind is the limitation of the cardiorespiratory reserve, orthostatic hypotension, obesity, whether the patient is cachectic or dehydrated, presence or absence of any cervical spine diseases, or pre-existing bony or neuromuscular pathologies. This is because neurosurgical procedures usually involve varied procedures which are more than often unphysiological. So these are the factors which actually will govern whether the patient will be able to tolerate a decent degree of unphysiological positioning for prolonged periods. Now, regarding the radiology, nobody expects you to be masters in that, but then it's a good idea if you can have a brief amount of preoperative look at the scans, because this will give you a decent amount of idea about the position of the tumor, the expected, uh, the consistency of the tumor, the proximity to important anatomical structures, venous sinuses, etc. And this will help you anticipate your anesthetic course. Now, coming to the investigations, routine investigations like hemoglobin, TLC, platelet count, coagulation, electrolytes, RBS, renal function test, HbA1c, and long-standing diabetes, chest X-ray, and ECG that we do for routine cases. However, certain specialized investigations also need mention, like transthoracic echocardiography, especially for those patients who are scheduled for sitting position, USG abdomen for those patients uh, uh, who have angioblastoma, to rule out polycystic kidney and pheochromocytoma, because they may be a part of the MEN, multiple endocrine neoplasia. Now, the ideal anesthetic management here consists of a smooth induction, maintenance of hemodynamic stability and cerebral perfusion patient pressure, providing a relaxed brain so that there is optimal surgical access, cerebral protection in case you cannot do it. There can it should be done in a manner so that there is no harm. Nowadays, neuro monitoring is coming up in a big way, so your anesthetic should be compatible with that, and aiming for a rapid and smooth emergence. Pre-medications like anxiolytic, sedative, and analgesic, they have to be titrated. Uh, if at all has to be given, should be short-acting or better avoided. This is because benzodiazepine and opioids can cause hypoventilation and partial upper airway obstruction, which can lead to hypercapnia. And hypercapnia itself can lead to raised cerebral blood flow, cerebral blood volume, and ultimately raised ICP. Aspiration prophylaxis is required because there may be increased acid secretion due to increased ICP and steroid treatment. And the raised ICP itself can causes delay in gastric emptying. So this is a must. And all the more important in patients having altered consciousness level, those who are diabetic because of the gastroparesis, same with pregnant patients, and those with impaired gag reflex. Pre-medications nowadays often is done with newer agents like Dexin, etc. Among other medications, anticonvulsant should be advised to be continued till the morning of surgery. So should be the steroids and CA inhibitors. Now, coming to the intraoperative monitoring, the usual minimum monitoring requirements include ECG because it helps in detecting response to intracranial retraction and manipulation. Brainstem manipulation often is associated with tachycardia, bradycardia, sinus arrhythmias, or PVTO. Whole lot of tachyarrhythmias can occur. So ECG, continuous ECG monitoring is important. Pulse oximetry, non-invasive blood pressure monitoring. Capnography is essential because it helps in facilitating ventilation, managing PaCO2, and detecting venous air embolism. However, it may not always correspond in elderly on patients with ventilation perfusion mismatch. That has to be kept in mind. Urine output It'll give us an indication of the perioperative fluid balance, the amount of diuretics, and the diuresis consequent to their use. In case of reduced output, there may be indication of hypovolemia or ADH released. And more so, these patients are prone to develop sodium and electrolyte disbalances like DI, SIA, DH. So early detection of those as well as diagnosis of those sodium and other electrolyte disabilities. So urinary output monitoring is important for those patients. Then specialized monitoring, we have invasive arterial catheter. As far as possible, preferably should be placed before induction for estimating the arterial blood pressure and cerebral perfusion pressure. Here, the transducer should be zeroed at the level of external auditory meters, which estimates the mean arterial pressure at the level of circle of Willis. Additionally, it also provides a sampling source for ABG and glucose. Then comes central venous catheter, which can be placed through the jugular, subclavian, or antecubital vein, depending upon the feasibility. CVP helps a rough estimate of fluid status and also provides a reliable mean of fluid, inotropic, and hypotonic solution administration. Especially should be placed if the tumor is in proximity to large arteries or venous sinuses, if the large vascular tumors are present, or if there is a risk of VAE present. Additionally, the other monitors are peripheral nerve stimulator because it helps in recognition of persistence of drug-induced skeletal muscle or paralysis, and highly specialized monitoring like transesophageal echocardiography, PA catheter, and ICP monitors can be used, but these are all patient selective and have to be used on a case-to-case basis. Induction and intubation of these patients, usual drugs like thiopentone, propofol, or barbiturates can be used because all of them decrease CBF, CMRO2, and intracranial pressure. Non-depolarizing muscle relaxants are usually preferred because choline increases ICP transiently. Often lignocaine or beta blockers can be used to blunt the hypertensive response prior to intubation. As we had said that the induction should be smooth and the pressure response should be as low as possible. And opioids or narcotics like morphine and fentanyl should be given in titrated doses. After induction comes the positioning. Commonly used positions are supine sitting, park bench, and prone. Of course, there are many other, but these are the commonest. We'll just run through those briefly. Supine position, as we can see in the figure, it's the most common. Here the head is elevated to 15 to 30 degrees to facilitate venous drainage. Excessive flexion or extension of the head should be avoided because venous drainage may be impaired. Sitting position has its own share of advantages like excellent surgical exposure and facilitation of cerebral, venous, and CSF drainage. However, disadvantages include decrease in blood pressure and cardiac output, or the potential hazard of venous air embolism. Then we have park bench position. The drawback here is that there is a good deal of ventilation perfusion mismatch, and common peroneal nerve is prone to getting injured. Dependent pinna also can get injured. Prone positioning causes pressure over the eyeball, pinna, and the genitalia. There may be kinking of neck veins. Extreme flexion of the head can cause migration of the tube or kinking, and brachial plexus, ulnar, and sciatic nerve injuries may occur with this type of positioning. Post positioning, the next step is pin fixation. We use different plays like different frames like Mayfield or Sugita's frame. So it's an intensely noxious stimulus because pin actually gets attached to the pericranium. So needs appropriate blunting by propofol, fentanyl, espoliol, labetalol, whatever may be the agent you prefer. And this is a potential phase where venous air embolism can occur. So should be careful about these complications during this phase. Now, once the positioning has been done, the maintenance can be done with oxygen and air mixture added to volatile anesthetics or propofol as and when required. And maintenance is with intermittent doses of non-depolarizing muscle relaxants and opioids. The usually targeted PSO2 is somewhere close to 32 to 35 millimeter of mercury. Either it's normocapnia or slight hypocapnia. Now, a bit about the volatile anesthetics. Amongst the different anesthetics, halothane is the one which causes maximum vasodilatation, followed by desflurane, and sevoflurane causes the least. CO2 responsiveness is preserved, and the autoregulation is preserved. And amongst them, the least impairment causing agent is sevoflurane. As we can see in this diagram, up to 0.5 MAC, CMR suppression occurs. So there is a net CBF decrease. At 1 MAC, CMR suppression equals vasodilatation. There also the CBF remains unchanged. However, beyond 1 MAC, CMR gets reduced, but the vasodilatory effect predominates. And this is where luxury perfusion comes into play. That is, the cerebral blood flow increases disproportionately to that is actually what is required for the cerebral metabolism. Now, nitrous is a very controversial topic. We'll just touch through it. Of course, it is known that it causes rise in the cerebral blood flow, cerebral metabolic rate, and ICP. And this effect is exaggerated when nitrous is used with other inhalation agents. However, when used with propofol, this augmentation is minimal. So it has to be selectively used. Apart from that, apart from the rise in ICP, other concerns are presence of intracranial air pockets, development of pneumocephalus, air embolism, effects evoke potential monitoring, and can cause post-operative nausea, vomiting. Now, this is what we had already talked, that up to 1 MAC, there occurs a correlation or a cordial relation between the cerebral blood flow as well as the CMR, cerebral metabolism. But beyond 1 MAC, cerebral blood flow predominates, whereas metabolism remains low. And that is where this uncoupling occurs. Now, the use of PEEP, we'll come to the ventilatory strategies. Often the use of PEEP is utilized for intraoperative ventilation. It should be used cautiously with monitoring because while increasing the PEEP, there is an increase in mean intrathoracic pressures, which impairs cerebral venous outflow and cardiac output. Up to less than 10 centimeter of water PEEP can be used without significant rise in ICP or decrease in cerebral perfusion pressure. We often come across a term called intraoperative tight brain, which actually requires brain relaxation. So here we need to actually look out for the cause and then treat it accordingly. Usual causes are relevant pressures like JVP, air pressure, arterial pressure, etc. may be disturbed, not within the normal range. Metabolism may be not controlled because of the patient's depth of anesthesia is not adequate. Patient may have seizures. Use of potential vasodilators like nitrous, calcium channel blocker, or nitroprusside, or any unrecognized mass lesion inside the brain, for example, blood or air pockets or nitrous pockets. So there may be raised JVP also, which may occur due to extreme head rotation or jugular venous compression, head posture, bronchospasm, straining, cuffing, pneumothorax, etc. So these, whatever may be the reason for the intraoperative tight brain, the first step is to identify it, and whatever may be the cause amongst all of these, that has to be treated. Now, hyperventilation earlier used to be pretty popular because lower PSAO2 causes, with 1 millimeter mercury drop causes a cerebral blood flow change of 1 to 2 ml per 100 gram per minute. This ICP lowering is transient, which stays for approximately 8 hours, and this maintains PSAO2 between 30 to 35 millimeter of mercury. We have certain drugs which are often used for reduction in brain volume.
Commonly used are mannitol, hypertonic saline, and furosemide. We'll just run through them briefly. Mannitol, which is the commonest drug, is used in the dosage of 0.25 to 1 gram per kg. It acts by causing an osmotic gradient, which causes movement of extravascular water to intravascular space across the blood-brain barrier. Action begins by 4 to 5 minutes, peaks at around 30 to 45 minutes, and lasts for around 2 to 3 hours. Apart from reduction in brain volume, it also causes free radical scavenging and inhibits cellular apoptosis. However, the side effects include hypotension, rebound intracranial hypertension, and renal failure. And it has to be used very cautiously if the serum osmolarity is more than 320 milliosmol. Then we also have hypertonic saline, which reduces cerebral edema, lowers ICP, and augments the cerebral perfusion pressure. This acts by causing osmotic shift of fluid from intracellular to intravascular and interstitial space. Theoretical benefit of hemodynamic stability also occurs in resuscitation of patients with shock and hypotension. And there may be hypokalemia, hyperchloremia, and mild metabolic acidosis. Complications with this agents include central pontine myelinolysis, skin sloughing, coagulopathy, and red cell lysis. Lastly, we have furosemide, that is the common Lasix, which hastens excretion of water from intracellular space and helps in maintaining the osmotic gradient. The presumed mechanism is the inhibition of chloride channel and prevention of accumulation of idogenic osmoles. And usual dose is 1.5 to 3 milligram per kg. Lastly, in extreme cases, we might have to resort to CSF drainage by either directly puncturing the ventricle or through the lumbar spinal catheter. However, it has to be done cautiously as brain herniation may occur, and in one setting, around 10 to 20 ml of CSF is drained. Now, fluid management, we need to avoid glucose-containing solution because hyperglycemia causes increased lactic production, intracellular acidosis, and aggravates neuronal injury. And the aim of intraoperative fluid management is to maintain normovolemia, normal tension, and avoiding reduction of serum osmolarity. Target hematocrit should be around 30%. Among crystalloids, normal saline, which is the commonest used or the most preferred solution, it is slightly hyperosmolar to plasma, and in large volumes can cause hyperosmolar chloremic acidosis. Ringal lactate, though is hyposmolar, is not that preferred. It has the disadvantage as large volumes can cause cerebral edema. Rarely, different colloids may be used. However, it is well known that starch causes reduction of coagulation factors, interferes with clotting mechanisms, and so limited doses should be used. Albumin is a reasonable choice, can be used depending upon the situation. Now, post-surgery, emergence has to be done in a very controlled manner, and it has to be done only in neurologically intact and uneventful in patients who have undergone an uneventful intraoperative course. The goals of emergence include smooth emergence, calm, cooperative, and response to verbal commands, and avoidance of coughing, bucking, and ventilator fight. Before going for emergence, it is important that normovolemia and normothermia is ensured, normotension is ensured, normoglycemia, mild hyperosmolarity, and appropriate hematocrit levels should all be ensured before planning an emergency. Quite often, many of the patients actually require post-operative elective ventilation. These are those patients who are neurologically compromised, and in those patients where extensive manipulation has taken place, or those who have developed facial or neck swelling, they are hypothermic or have undergone metabolic derangements, have significant brain edema or raised ICs, surgery which involves vital areas, or in those patients who have suffered significant ischemia due to prolonged vascular clipping or extensive retraction. Now, delayed emergence, it is a undesired condition which occurs, or rather it is defined as when the patient is unable to follow simple verbal commands after 20 to 30 minutes of pharmacological cessation of anesthesia. This is a commonly encountered scenario in neurological procedures. Once the anesthetic causes have been ruled out, we need to find the non-anesthetic causes, which usually are seizure, cerebral edema, intracranial hematoma, pneumocephalus, ischemia, or metabolic or electrolyte abnormalities, and it has to be corrected accordingly. Both early awakening and late awakening have their advantages and disadvantages. Early awakening has the advantages that early neurological examination and intervention is possible. There can be early indication of further investigations, and there is less stress response. However, the drawback is there is increased risk of hypoxemia and hypercapnia, and they require vigilant monitoring in the ICU.
Dr. Rudrashish,
Yes, sir. Sir.
because we are running late, I request you to complete next 5
Right.
or 6 minutes, please.
Right, sir. I'm on time. I should be covering within 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Delayed awakening has the advantage of less risk of hypoxemia and hypercapnia, better hemodynamic and respiratory control, and earlier transfer to ICU. And the disadvantages include lesser neurological monitoring and larger catecholamine surges because the patient remains intubated. Just a few words about the upcoming modality, which is awake craniotomy. Here the patient remains relatively awake, and surgery is conducted under sedation with local anesthetics. The advantages is that it avoids functional lesa, that is loss of function, by allowing maximum resection with simultaneous preservation of neurological function. And it has specific indications like epilepsy surgeries or tumors and AVM in those areas of brain which are known as eloquent areas, or they control the motor movements of the brain, of the body. Advantages include it avoids GA, monitoring required is less intense, cortical brain mapping can be done, and better resource utilization. However, not every patient is a good candidate. There are certain requirements, like the patient needs to be cooperative, able to participate in cognitive testing, uncomplicated airway, absence of sleep apnea, absence of pre-existing paralysis, and absence of mental impairment. Various anesthetic protocols include neurolep anesthesia, propofol opioid infusion, which used to be done previously, a sleep technique using LMA, and nowadays which is being followed is MAC, or conscious sedation with short-acting anesthetic agents and local anesthetics. However, the complications of awake craniotomy should also be borne in mind. They include seizures, decreased level of consciousness, increased ICP, neurological deficits, nausea, vomiting, and pain and loss of cooperation. That's all from my end. Thanks a lot.